Hey, what's happening, guys? Today we're going to install a set of full-length subframe connectors, jacking rails, and a web brace to connect the two on a 79 to 04 Mustang. So we're going to start this video off with the very basics. What are subframe connectors? Subframe connectors do exactly what they say. They connect the front subframe to the rear subframe of the vehicle. What is the advantage of this? Well, it reduces chassis flex. And chassis flex, if you think about it, is really sort of a fifth spring, if you will, as far as the suspension is concerned, because you can have a really tight, super aggressive suspension, but if the chassis is flexing, it's also going to act as essentially, like I said, a fifth spring in the suspension. So you really want to get the chassis as stiff as possible so the suspension can do its job properly. Now, the vehicle that we're going to be dealing with in this video is an SN95 Mustang, or essentially a Fox body Mustang. These cars are notoriously weak in the floor pan, and they benefit a great deal from a set of subframe connectors. But if you guys notice, if you go out there and start shopping for subframe connectors for an S550 or an S197 car, you know, the later body styles that have come out, subframe connectors really don't exist. Why? Because the car doesn't need them. You could take a Fox body Mustang, put a set of full subframe connectors in it, do a jacking rail, tie the two together with some bracing, and put a roll cage in it, and it still won't be as stiff as an S197 or an S550 with nothing done to it. These cars are extremely flexible as far as the chassis is concerned. The worst section of this chassis is really the sheet metal from the back of the front subframe to the front of the rear subframe. So this is the area that I'm talking about. This is right at the back of the front subframe, and this is the front of the rear subframe. This section right here is essentially just sheet metal. Now, if you look here, this is actually the rear of the front seat mount. These two like reinforcing blocks that you see here, and these two, you know, bolts sticking through are for the back of the front seats. What's extremely common to happen to these cars, and especially the Fox body Mustangs that have been launched hard, driven aggressively by a heavy driver, they will actually crack the floor pan on the outside over here between the seat reinforcement and the pinch weld. Somewhere in this area, the floor pan will crack. The back of the seat will actually collapse, and the back of the seat will actually start to drop. So, like I said, this area is notoriously weak, and that is why when you weld in a set of subframe connectors that have a good seat brace on the bottom of them, that is why the car feels so much stiffer, because this is literally the most flexible point of the car, and the back of the seat is bolted to it. So this is the subframe connector that we're going to be installing in this video. This is made by Maximum Motorsport. This is their XL, you know, extended length subframe connector. It also features the seat reinforcement for the back of the front seats that you weld on. So these are what we're going to be installing in this video. But in addition to this, I have some other parts because my situation is a little unique. Now, in addition to the subframe connectors, I'm going to be installing this stuff that you see up here. What this stuff is, first of all, this is a jacking rail. This is just 1.5 by 1.5 by 1 inch thick square tubing. I welded the ends on it, threw some paint on it real quick, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to tie the jacking rail to the subframe connector with a set of Stifflers web braces. So all this stuff is going to get welded together, welded to the bottom of the car, and hopefully it should stiffen everything up. And ultimately, this jacking rail should keep me from tearing up my pinch welds, because this car goes up and off of my lift so much that the pinch welds on it were just starting to get a little bit mutilated. All right, so since I have a strange hang-up about catching my car on fire, I did a little bit more disassembly than what most people do for a set of subframe connectors. So I removed the plastic rocker panel trim down here. I also removed both front seats, as you can see, and the rear seat. We'll get into this, why I removed the rear seat, a little bit later on in the video, but it really doesn't take a whole lot to remove this rear seat. These little white clips right here, all you do is you just push in on the end, and it'll release. You can have the rear seat out of this car in a minute. Front seats, just 4 bolts. Driver's side has a plug. And then I removed some of the rocker trim down here to expose, the edge of the carpet, so I can pull the carpet back, spray the floor down with water if need be, if the floor gets too hot. One more thing you guys may need to disassemble is I'm just tying back these brake lines with a zip tie. I just took them out of the clip, out of the holder, zip tied them back toward the fuel line, and gave myself some room in here to weld. The other thing you guys may need to be aware of if you have a Fox body is the emergency brake cables. At the back, you may have to do something with the emergency brake cables, move them out of the way, get yourself some room to be able to go in there and weld the jacking rail in. Other thing you need to be aware of is the exhaust. On the inside, give yourself enough space to weld the inside of the subframe connector. Make sure you have room between the connector and the exhaust that you can get the welder in there. So it's going to be very situational depending on, the type of connector you're welding in, the type of car you're dealing with, the combination of parts it has on it. But just give yourself some space to be able to get the welder in to where you need to go. Now, the first thing you need to do as far as the installation is concerned is you need to test fit everything that you have. So I'm using a couple pole jacks, putting the subframe connector in place. I'm using a couple pairs of vice grips. I'm going to put the jacking rail in place. I'm going to get everything approximately where it's supposed to go. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to start marking out where I need to remove paint off of the car and the subframe connector, as well as the jacking rail, so I can weld everything in place. I have some extra work involved just because I'm installing the web brace in between the two. When you're test fitting the web brace, make sure you have clearance between your fuel lines, brake lines, and the web brace. The web brace has to go in a very specific spot for it to clear the fuel lines and brake lines. So make sure you have everything in place, have everything in a spot that it's going to clear everything, and then you can go ahead and mark everything, and then you can start grinding. If you check this out, all these spots are where that I'm gonna have to do grinding. So as you can see, there's quite a bit of grinding that I'm gonna have to do to get the web brace in between the jacking rail and the subframe connector. But at the end of the day, it is what it is. It kind of sucks that, I paid a premium to get the powder coated subframe connectors, and then, I'm grinding like a third of it off, but it is what it is. So I'm gonna do that off camera. I'm gonna get all this stuff ground down, get all these spots that, need ground, and then I'll bring you guys back when I'm ready to, start welding things in. So now that I've got the paint cleaned off, all the places that I need to weld, I'm actually ready to start doing some welding. Now, what I'm doing is I'm gonna weld on the seat bracket to the subframe connector. Now, where you position the seat bracket on the subframe connector is what's going to determine where the subframe connector sits forward or backward on the car. So what I'm doing here is I have a floor jack that I'm just going to raise the subframe connector up to the bottom of the car, make sure that the subframe connector is in the correct position, and then I'm going to weld it in. On these Maximum Motorsport subframe connectors, the front edge of the subframe connector is even with the front edge of the front subframe. So it's real easy to determine, forward and backward what the position needs to be. Now, once I got the seat bracket tacked into place, I pulled everything back off in an assembly, converted my ESAB Rebel over to a TIG welder, and TIG welded the seat bracket to the subframe connector. So this next section that I'm going to show you where I finally weld in the connectors, it's going to be a situation of do as I say and not necessarily as I do. The reason I say that is because I have the vehicle supported on my lift, and the lift is holding the vehicle up by the chassis. When you're welding in a set of subframe connectors, you really want to have the vehicle supported by the suspension. If you have the vehicle supported by the chassis, there is the possibility that you could have the chassis twisted or tweaked in some way that when you weld the connectors in, you're then going to brace the chassis in that tweaked position. So you want to have the weight of the vehicle on the suspension so the chassis is in a relaxed state as it normally is when it's driving down the road. And at that point is when you want to brace it. My situation is a little bit different. The jack stands that I own, because I own a lift, I don't own a good set of jack stands. So unfortunately, I can't get the vehicle high enough off the ground with it supported by the suspension for me to be able to get underneath the car with a welding helmet on and get in a comfortable position that I can see and that I can weld. That's the thing, guys. If you can't see, you can't weld. So I understand the situation that I'm doing this in isn't ideal. The other thing you guys need to note is you need to have the door open and checking on the carpet inside the car regularly. My floor pan really didn't get all that hot, but I really didn't want to catch the interior of my car on fire. So I was making, you know, like a 3-inch long weld on my final finish weld, and then I would go in and check the interior, move somewhere else, make a 3-inch weld, check the interior. So I'm constantly back and forth between the bottom of the car and the interior just to make sure that I don't have any problems. I'll be honest with you guys. I had a bit of a scare over on the passenger side. I caught the inside of the frame rail on fire. Let me explain. So when I was welding the passenger side, you can see this is probably like a 5 or 6 inch long weld that I had to do here. Now, I tried to do this in one pass. That is a mistake. Do not try and weld this all in one pass. The reason I'm saying this is because you're going to have a ton of heat built up in this frame rail, and what's going to happen is you're going to catch the inside of the frame rail on fire. I did it. Over on the passenger side, I got to about 3/4 of the way across. I had a flame shoot out the control arm hole, another flame shoot out up here, up by the emergency brake cable. And I had to do the best I could to, spray water down inside this cavity to try and put the fire out. So my suggestion is do this in like, a 2-inch stitch weld, and then go up to the front of the car, do some more welding, come back to this, do another 2-inch stitch weld, move somewhere else, move this around. So don't just try and buzz all the way across here like I did. The other thing that I've seen, guys, is people that have caught the inner frame rail like that on fire, if it continues to burn and you can't get it put out, what ends up happening is it catches the bottom of the seat on fire inside the car. If it catches the bottom of the seat on fire, the foam in the seat burns awesome. I've seen guys ruin their interior because they caught the foam for the rear seats on fire because of what I just explained here. So be very mindful when you're welding this area.
So in an attempt to eliminate any sort of like chassis twists when I welded in these frame connectors, what I did was I put it down on the stands, and then what I did was I did like between 8 and 10 good hard tacks all over the place on these subframe connectors to try and get, a good tack, a good bond with the car. So when I raise the car up and I do my final finish weld, the car isn't going to be twisted. So as far as doing my final welds, guys, like I said, I'm moving around a lot, and you'll see me disappear for a length of time in this time lapse and then just reappear, and you'll see me go up and check the inside of the car. I do like a 3-inch weld, and I'll get up and check the inside of the car. After I check the inside of the car, I go to the opposite end and do another 3-inch weld. So I'm kind of, bouncing around the car, welding different sections at different times to try and keep the heat input to the car as low as I can. As far as what you need to weld on the subframe connectors, Maximum Motorsport is very clear. They do not want the ends of the subframe connectors welded to the car. So the very end that you see kind of up toward the top of the subframe connector, they don't want the end welded, because the end, if you weld it across the subframe, the heat affected zone is then perpendicular to the frame itself and could cause the frame to crack. So keep that in mind. As far as the rest of what you need to weld, you weld about 4 or 5 inches toward the front of the subframe connector on both sides. At the rear of the front subframe, you weld around the 2 tabs they give you on each side. And then at the back, the rear subframe, you weld the entire length that, connects it to the car. One thing they did mention in their instructions is you could also stitch weld a 1-inch stitch weld every 3 inches between the 2 weld points on the front. So that's what I did. Because let's be honest, you're not going to come back in here 5 years from now and put more weld in here. So you might as well just do it once and do it right. So now that I have the subframe connectors all burned in, the next thing I'm going to attack is going to be the jacking rails. And I attach these the exact same way. So I put the car down on the ground, well, you know, supported by the suspension on the jack stands, tacked the rail in place, and then put it up and did my final finish weld. As far as welding the jacking rail to the pinch weld, I'll be honest with you guys, it sucks. The material on the jacking rail is much thicker than the material on the pinch weld. So when you go to weld the two together, it's real easy to just burn away at the pinch weld and basically blow holes in it. So the way I did it was I just did a series of tacks along the jacking rail. And then what I did was I went back over top of all the tacks with like a finish weld. So it has a decent looking appearance to it. I'm not saying it's going to be anything great, but it looks a heck of a lot better than, 80 tacks along your pinch weld. So the final thing I need to do for the subframe connector is going to be a couple things. First of all, this reinforcing plate that I am welding in right now, this reinforcing plate goes over the dimpled area just behind the front subframe. And what this is for is if the bottom of your floor pan is distorted, what Maximum Motorsport wants you to do is actually bend the subframe connector to fit your floor. And if you're going to bend the subframe connector, you don't want a reinforcing plate on there, so they don't weld it on themselves. You have to do it yourself. So that is what I'm welding on here. And then the final thing is, once I'm done welding on the subframe connector, the final thing you need to weld is there's 2 holes, one on each subframe connector, that you have to weld shut. What that's for is any moisture that's inside the connector will get boiled off and evaporate out that hole. And then when you're done welding, you weld the hole shut and it'll keep the subframe connector from rotting from the inside out.
Okay, so I went and got the matrix brace or the web brace up in place. You're going to take the sleeves and just push them out, firm against the subframe connector. And then you're going to lay a tack weld right here in the edge just to, hold this where it's supposed to be. And then you're going to take the whole thing down and then you'll finish weld all the way around this tube and get this, end welded in place on every one of these. So you got to do that to obviously, the one in the back, the one in the front, the one on the passenger side of the back, passenger side front. So there's quite a bit of welding that needs to be done on these sleeves all the way around. And then before you get it, back up into place, you want to get the top of it all painted up.
So now that I have the sleeves all TIG welded in, I have the top side of the sleeve and the web brace all painted, I can go ahead and burn in the web brace to the subframe connector and to the jacking rail. Now, how much of a difference the jacking rail and the web brace makes, I honestly couldn't tell you guys. I know there aren't many companies out there that sell these web braces and jacking rails as opposed to just subframe connectors. There's a bunch of companies that just sell subframe connectors. Usually that's pretty indicative of the fact that there probably isn't a huge strength advantage to adding the jacking rail and the web brace. But like I told you earlier, with this car being on this lift so much, I wanted to, try and preserve the pinch welds as much as I could.
So after you get everything all welded in, the last thing you need to do is go through and paint all your welds, get everything coated in paint so it doesn't rust. So I went ahead and did all that stuff. I used some matte black Rust-Oleum, nothing exotic, but it matches fairly well to the subframe connectors that were powder coated by Maximum Motorsport. From everything I've seen and read, this makes a huge difference in the way the car sort of feels driving down the road. Unfortunately, I've got some other work that I need to do to this car, so I haven't actually driven it yet. I'll put it down in the pinned comment, kind of what my thoughts were after doing all these mods. Was it worth it? From everything I've seen and read, yeah, it's going to be a big difference. With that, guys, I'll put links in the description to the subframe connectors, to the web brace, and to the jacking rail if you guys are interested in that stuff. As always, guys, if you guys like the video, hit like. If you want to see more content, go down and hit subscribe. Thanks for watching, guys.